The Battle of Kohima, fought from April to June 1944, stands as one of the most pivotal and fiercely contested engagements of World War II in Southeast Asia. Often referred to as the Stalingrad of the East, the battle marked a decisive turning point in the Burma campaign, halting the Japanese advance into India and shifting the momentum in favor of the Allies in the region. This lengthy and comprehensive examination of the Battle of Kohima delves into the strategic importance of the conflict, the brutal combat conditions, and the broader implications for the outcome of the war. The battle took place in the rugged hills of northeastern India, in the state of Nagaland, centered around the small hill town of Kohima. The terrain was unforgiving, with steep, jungle-covered mountains and narrow ridges that made conventional military operations exceedingly difficult. The road from Dimapur to Impol, a vital supply line for the Allied forces in Burma, passed through Kohima, making the town strategically crucial. The Japanese 15th Army, under command of Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, had launched a major offensive, codenamed Operation Yugo, with the aim of invading India, capturing the key logistical hub of Impol, and encouraging an uprising against British rule in India. Kohima was the linchpin in this plan. Its capture would allow the Japanese to cut off the supply route to Impol and effectively isolate the Allied forces in Burma. In the early stages of the offensive, the Japanese forces advanced with remarkable speed, pushing the British and Indian troops back and threatening to overrun the region. The defenders of Kohima, a mix of British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers, were outnumbered and outgunned. Commanded by Colonel Hugh Richards, they prepared for what seemed like an inevitable and desperate last stand. The garrison consisted of the 4th Battalion of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment, supported by elements of the Assam Rifles and the Indian National Army. These troops, many of whom were inexperienced in jungle warfare, faced the daunting task of defending a small and poorly fortified perimeter against a determined and battle-hardened enemy. The battle began in earnest on April 4, 1944, when the Japanese 31st Division, under command of Lieutenant General Kotoku Sato, launched a series of coordinated assaults on the Kohima Ridge. The initial Japanese attacks were relentless, with wave after wave of infantry attempting to break through the thinly held Allied defenses. The defenders were forced to retreat to the high ground surrounding the Deputy Commissioner's bungalow, which became the focal point of the battle. The fighting was intense and often hand-to-hand, as the Japanese soldiers, adept at infiltration and night attacks, sought to overrun the positions held by the Allied forces. One of the most iconic and harrowing episodes of the Battle of Kohima took place at the tennis court, a small and seemingly insignificant feature of the Deputy Commissioner's compound that became the site of some of the most brutal combat of the entire battle. The tennis court, with its open, flat surface, was transformed into a deadly killing ground. The Japanese occupied one side of the court, while the British and Indian soldiers held the other, with the two sides separated by no more than a few yards of exposed ground. The fighting here was characterized by relentless artillery bombardments, sniper fire, and savage bayonet charges, as both sides fought with extraordinary tenacity to gain control of this key position. The defenders, despite being severely outnumbered and under constant pressure, managed to hold their ground, though at a terrible cost in lives. The siege of Kohima dragged on for several weeks, with the Japanese forces making repeated attempts to breach the defenses and overwhelm the garrison. Supplies and ammunition for the defenders were running critically low, and the situation appeared increasingly dire. However, the Allies were not prepared to abandon Kohima. Reinforcements, including the 2nd Division of the British Army under Major General John Grover, were dispatched to relieve the beleaguered garrison. These fresh troops began a grueling march through the jungle to reach Kohima, facing constant harassment from Japanese patrols and struggling with the treacherous terrain. The arrival of the 2nd Division in late April marked a turning point in the battle. The reinforcements brought much-needed supplies, including food, water, and ammunition, as well as heavy artillery, which allowed the Allies to counter the Japanese attacks more effectively. The relief force, along with the exhausted but determined defenders, launched a series of counterattacks to push the Japanese back from the ridges surrounding Kohima. These counterattacks were met with fierce resistance, as the Japanese, despite their own mounting casualties and dwindling supplies, fought desperately to hold on to their gains. By mid-May, the tide of the battle had begun to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. The Japanese forces, having suffered heavy losses and unable to break through the Allied defenses, were gradually pushed back from the heights around Kohima. The combined effects of artillery bombardments, airstrikes, and the relentless pressure of the Allied counterattacks began to take their toll on the Japanese troops, who were now suffering from severe shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition. The psychological strain of the protracted and bloody fighting also weighed heavily on the Japanese soldiers, many of whom had been fighting continuously for weeks with little rest. The climax of the battle came in late May and early June, as the Allied forces mounted a final all-out assault to dislodge the Japanese from the last of their defensive positions around Kohima. The fighting during this phase was particularly brutal, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties in close-quarters combat. The Japanese, now outnumbered and with their supply lines cut, were unable to hold their positions and were forced to retreat. By June 22, 1944, the last of the Japanese forces had been driven from the Kohima Ridge, and the battle was effectively over. The victory at Kohima was a significant and hard-won achievement for the Allies. The battle had been fought at enormous cost, with the Allies suffering over 4,000 casualties and the Japanese losses estimated at around 7,000 dead. The defeat marked the end of the Japanese offensive into India and was a major blow to Japanese morale and military capability in the region. The failure of the Japanese to capture Kohima and Impol, coupled with the subsequent Allied counteroffensive, effectively ended Japanese hopes of turning the tide in Southeast Asia. The Battle of Kohima had far-reaching implications for the broader war in the Asia-Pacific theater. It represented the beginning of the end for Japanese forces in Burma, who, following their defeat at Kohima and Impol, were forced into a long and costly retreat that would eventually lead to the reoccupation of Burma by Allied forces. The battle also demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied air power, logistics, and coordination in jungle warfare, setting the stage for further successes in the Burma campaign. In addition to its military significance, the Battle of Kohima has left a lasting legacy in the collective memory of the British and Indian armies. The Kohima War Cemetery, located on the site of the battle, serves as a solemn reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought and died there. The cemetery is inscribed with the now famous epitaph, "When you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow we gave our today," a poignant tribute to the soldiers who gave their lives in defense of Kohima. The battle also holds a significant place in the history of the Nagas, the indigenous people of the region who were caught in the crossfire of the conflict. Many Nagas serve as guides, porters, and soldiers for the Allied forces, and their contribution to the battle has been recognized and honored in the years since. The Battle of Kohima is remembered not only as a turning point in the war, but also as a moment of profound resilience and sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. In the broader context of World War II, the Battle of Kohima highlights the global nature of the conflict and the interconnectedness of the various theaters of war. While the battles in Europe and the Pacific often dominate historical narratives, the fierce and decisive engagements in Southeast Asia, such as Kohima, played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the war. The battle exemplifies the strategic importance of India in the Allied war effort, as well as the determination and bravery of the soldiers who fought in some of the most challenging and inhospitable conditions of the entire war. In conclusion, the Battle of Kohima was a critical and decisive engagement that not only halted the Japanese advance into India, but also marked a turning point in the Burma campaign and the broader war in Southeast Asia. The battle's legacy continues to be remembered and honored, both in the military histories of the nations involved and in the collective memory of those who lived through it. It stands as a testament to the resilience, courage, and sacrifice of the soldiers and civilians who endured one of the most brutal and challenging battles of World War II.